The clock in the small bookstore Pages and Memories read exactly 9:43 a.m. when Sarah Henderson looked up from the book she was cataloging. The chime of the doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of someone who would change her life forever. The sound of firm footsteps on the old wooden floor echoed through the quiet space, and a commanding presence filled the room. Sarah adjusted her delicate framed glasses and observed the man approaching the counter. Tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that likely cost more than her annual salary, Alexander Mitchell radiated an air of power and mystery that seemed entirely out of place in this small, peaceful town. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep and measured, as if every word had been carefully chosen. "I'm looking for Miss Henderson." Sarah's heart inexplicably quickened. How did he know her name? The bookstore rarely saw visitors who weren't locals, let alone someone who looked more suited to a boardroom in a skyscraper than this dusty little shop. "That's me," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady as she rose from the worn chair where she had been sitting. Alexander studied her for a moment with piercing blue eyes, as if confirming something he already knew. "I have a job proposal for you. Something that will require your specific skills in organization and documentation." Sarah frowned, puzzled. She had never advertised her professional skills beyond the town's boundaries. How could he possibly know about her experience? "I'm sorry, but how did you?" "I know a great deal about you, Miss Henderson," he interrupted softly. "I know you have a master's degree in library science, that you worked for 3 years at the municipal archive before taking over this bookstore, and that your thesis on digital cataloging systems received an award." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. That information wasn't publicly available. Alexander continued, seemingly unaware of her discomfort. "I need someone with your qualifications to organize my private library and a series of important documents. The pay will be 5 times your current salary with additional benefits." The offer was too tempting to ignore, especially given the financial struggles Sarah faced to keep the bookstore afloat. Yet there was something unsettling about the way Alexander seemed to know so much about her. "Why me?" she asked bluntly, surprising herself with her boldness. A cryptic smile appeared on his lips. "Because you're the best at what you do, Miss Henderson. And because I need someone who understands the importance of keeping certain secrets." At that moment, Mrs. Collins, a regular customer, entered the bookstore. Alexander pulled a card from the inner pocket of his jacket and placed it on the counter. "Consider my proposal. The address is on the card. I expect your visit tomorrow at 10 a.m. should you be interested." Before Sarah could respond, he had already turned and was walking toward the door, leaving behind only the thick, subtly scented card and a disturbing sense that there was far more to this offer than met the eye. That night, in her small apartment above the bookstore, Sarah couldn't sleep. Alexander's card rested on her bedside table, its elegant embossed font catching the soft glow of the lamp. His words echoed in her mind, accompanied by the silent warning of her intuition. She was about to dive into something far greater than merely organizing documents. The next day, promptly at 10 a.m., Sarah parked her modest car in front of the imposing gates of the Mitchell mansion. The Victorian structure loomed majestically atop the hill, its tall windows seeming to watch her with the same intensity as its owner's gaze. The butler who greeted her, an elderly man named Walter, guided her through hallways adorned with artwork that undoubtedly belonged in museums. Each step on the marble floor drew her deeper into a world that felt like a parallel reality to her simple life in the small town. Alexander awaited her in his office, an impressive room with walls paneled in dark wood and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The light streaming through the tall windows cast intricate shadows on the Persian rug, giving the space an almost theatrical atmosphere. "I'm glad you accepted my invitation, Miss Henderson," he said, gesturing for her to sit in one of the leather armchairs facing his desk. "I haven't accepted yet," Sarah replied, once again surprising herself with her boldness. "First, I need to understand exactly what this job entails." Alexander leaned forward, his piercing eyes locking onto hers with unsettling intensity. "Of course. The job is straightforward, organizing my private library and a collection of personal documents. However," he paused meaningfully, "I must warn you that once you accept, there is no turning back. Some of the information you'll encounter here may change your life forever." Sarah felt the weight of his words, as if they carried an unspoken significance she couldn't yet grasp. Her rational mind urged her to decline, to retreat to the safety of her bookstore. But there was something else, an irresistible curiosity pushing her to accept, even as she sensed she was on the brink of crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. "When do I start?" The words slipped from her lips before she could stop them. Alexander's smile was both satisfied and enigmatic. "Immediately." And with those two simple words, Sarah Henderson took her first step into a mystery that would unveil secrets long buried. Secrets that connected her life to Alexander Mitchell's in ways she could never have imagined. Alexander Mitchell's private library occupied an entire wing on the mansion's second floor, a space so vast that Sarah needed several minutes to take in its sheer magnitude. It was a breathtaking room that spanned 3 levels, connected by black wrought iron spiral staircases with gilded details that shimmered under the natural light streaming through the towering arched windows. The characteristic aroma of aged books and leather mingled with the faint scent of polished wood and beeswax, creating an atmosphere that, under different circumstances, would have felt like paradise to Sarah. The dark mahogany bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, their shelves bowing slightly under the weight of leather-bound volumes, some clearly centuries old. During her first week, Sarah methodically set about cataloging the vast collection. Her fingers glided over gold-embossed spines and engraved titles, uncovering rare works that would make any university library green with envy. Walter, the gray-haired butler with impeccable posture, periodically appeared with a silver tea cart, serving Earl Grey in delicate porcelain alongside buttery biscuits. "The master has quite specific tastes in his collections," Walter remarked during one of his visits, his casual tone carrying a weight that Sarah couldn't entirely decipher. His eyes, framed by deep wrinkles, seemed to hold secrets she wasn't yet ready to uncover. Sarah noticed that certain cabinets and drawers were locked, marked with small golden tags that appeared to follow a unique cataloging system. On her first day, Alexander had handed her a ring of antique keys with specific instructions on which areas to prioritize in her organizational work. It was during the second week that the first anomalies began to emerge. Among the old Mitchell family documents, neatly arranged in leather folders bearing the family crest, Sarah found something that made her blood run cold. A photograph of herself from 15 years ago, back when she was still in college. In the image, captured with striking clarity, she was walking distractedly across the university campus, clutching a stack of books against her chest. Her brown hair was longer back then, and she wore the same delicate framed glasses that had become her trademark. The most unsettling part was that she vividly remembered that day. She had just left the library after finishing research for her thesis. With trembling hands, Sarah turned the photograph over. On the back, meticulous handwriting noted not only the date and time but also specific details. Sarah Henderson, Central Library, 3:47 p.m. Research on digital cataloging systems and historical archives. Contact with Professor Richards for guidance. It wasn't the only one. There were more photographs, all documented with the same disturbing precision. Sarah in a cafe 3 years later. Sarah walking down the main street of town shortly before she took over the bookstore. Sarah chatting with customers, organizing books, living her life entirely unaware that she was being observed. "I see you found the first pieces of the puzzle," Alexander's voice sounded behind her, making her jump. She hadn't heard him enter the library, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpet covering the wooden floor. "What does this mean?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly as she held the photographs like evidence of a crime. "Why do you have these pictures of me? Why have you been watching me all these years?" Alexander approached her with slow, measured steps. He wore a sharp gray suit that seemed to intensify the piercing blue of his eyes. "It's not as simple as it seems, Sarah. Every document in this library tells a story, and yours is intertwined with mine in ways you have yet to understand. This is harassment," Sarah said, taking a step back until she felt the solid bookshelf behind her. "I'm calling the police." "You can do that," Alexander replied calmly, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to clean his glasses, which didn't seem to need cleaning, a gesture Sarah interpreted as a sign of carefully controlled nervousness. "But before you do, I suggest you take a look at the blue folder in the third drawer of the file cabinet to your right. There's something in there you need to see." Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might escape her chest. The rational part of her mind screamed for her to flee immediately, but years of academic curiosity and an inexplicable hunch drove her toward the indicated drawer. The drawer slid open smoothly on well-oiled tracks. The blue folder was there, seemingly ordinary, but the weight of the documents inside suggested its contents were anything but. Inside, there were meticulously organized documents about her father, Thomas Henderson. Detailed reports on his activities as a senior accountant at Mitchell Enterprises, including records of secret meetings, copies of coded emails, and details about suspicious bank transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands. The last document was a handwritten letter, dated 2 weeks before his sudden death from natural causes 10 years ago. Her father's familiar handwriting, usually so firm and precise, showed signs of haste or agitation. "Your father worked directly for me," Alexander explained softly, watching the emotions cross Sarah's face as she read. "He was more than an employee, he was an upright man who discovered something he shouldn't have, something that not only put his life at risk, but also the lives of everyone he loved. And before he died, he made me promise one thing, that I would protect you, his only daughter, at all costs." Sarah let the documents fall onto the heavy oak table, her legs buckling under the weight of the revelations. Walter appeared silently, just as he always did, with a leather chair, as if he had been expecting this moment. "My father," she began, her voice faltering as long-suppressed memories resurfaced. "His death wasn't natural, was it?" "No," Alexander confirmed, his eyes showing an unexpected compassion. "He uncovered a complex money laundering scheme involving some of the highest-ranking executives at the company. Powerful people who wouldn't hesitate to silence any threat to their operation. And the photographs? The constant surveillance?" Sarah gestured to the images spread across the table, each one a stolen moment of her life. "It was the only way to keep my promise," he replied, picking up one of the photographs and studying it with an enigmatic expression. "To ensure you were safe even if you didn't know you were in danger. Every movement you made was monitored, every important decision in your life subtly guided to keep you protected." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the avalanche of information. Her entire life, all the moments she thought were her own choices, her decision to study library science, to return to the small town, to run a quiet bookstore, had all been subtly influenced, orchestrated like a complex symphony to keep her away from harm. "Why bring me here now?" she finally asked, opening her eyes to face Alexander. "Why show me all of this after all this time?" "Because they're coming back," Alexander said, his expression hardening as he walked over to one of the tall windows. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the glass, creating unsettling patterns on the carpet. "And this time we need to face them together." At that moment, a distant sound of glass shattering echoed through the mansion, followed by the sharp blare of the alarm system. Walter hurried into the library, his usually impassive face marked with concern. "Sir," Walter said urgently, "they're here." The security cameras detected 3 armed men at the east perimeter. Alexander moved swiftly to a specific shelf, his fingers finding a hidden mechanism that, when triggered, revealed a secret passage behind the wooden panels. The cold, damp air emanating from the opening carried the weight of even deeper secrets. "Sarah," Alexander extended his hand to her, his eyes conveying an urgency that couldn't be ignored. "We need to go. Now." Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her world spinning in a whirlpool of revelations and imminent danger. The photographs still spread across the table seemed to mock her, silent reminders of a life that was never truly her own. Then, with a decision that would change the course of her life forever, she took Alexander's outstretched hand and followed him into the dark passage, leaving behind not just the library, but all the certainty she had about her life up until that point. The secret passage spiraled down gently, illuminated by ancient bronze lanterns fixed to the stone walls. The air was thick with the weight of decades, perhaps centuries, of secrets. Sarah followed Alexander through the tunnel, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor, while Walter silently closed the rear. "This passage was built during the Civil War," Alexander explained as they walked, his low voice reverberating off the damp walls. "It's part of a network of tunnels connecting several points of the property. My family always prepared for the worst." After a few minutes of descent, they reached a circular room that resembled a modern bunker, starkly contrasting with the ancient passage. Security monitors covered one wall, showing different angles of the mansion. On other screens, Sarah recognized live images of the city, including the facade of her bookstore. "Monitoring center," Walter explained, moving quickly to a control panel. "From here we can observe any suspicious activity on the property and key points of the city." Sarah watched the screens with a mix of fascination and horror. On one of the monitors, 3 men dressed in black moved methodically through the mansion's gardens, their weapons clearly visible. "Who are they?" "The same ones who killed your father," Alexander replied, his eyes fixed on the screens. "Or rather, they work for them. The organization is called the Consortium, a group of corrupt executives who turned Mitchell Enterprises into their own money laundering machine." He turned to a metal file and pulled out a thick folder. "Your father discovered something that could destroy them completely. He was gathering evidence, preparing a dossier that would expose the entire operation. And that's why they killed him," Sarah finished, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and pain. "Yes, but they never found the evidence," Alexander continued, opening the folder on a nearby table. Thomas was smarter than they thought. He hid the most crucial information in a place no one would think to look. Sarah moved closer to the table, her eyes scanning the scattered documents. There were financial reports, printed emails, photographs of secret meetings, and... Wait, this is from the bookstore? She picked up an old photograph of Paginas and Memorias, dated 20 years ago, when it was still owned by Mr. Jenkins, the former proprietor. In the image, her father was talking to the old bookseller at the counter. The bookstore wasn't just a local business, Walter intervened softly. It was a meeting point for people fighting against the consortium. Mr. Jenkins was one of us. Us? Sarah asked, feeling that every answer only raised more questions. Alexander sighed deeply. There's a group, a secret organization within Mitchell Enterprises, working to expose and dismantle the consortium. Your father was one of us. So was Walter. And now? A sharp alarm interrupted his explanation. On the screens, the men had found the entrance to the library and were methodically searching for something. They know about the documents, Alexander said, quickly gathering the folder. Somehow, they discovered that Thomas hid the evidence here. But why now? Sarah asked, watching the intruders ransack the library she had just organized a few minutes ago. Why after all this time? Because the consortium is planning something big, Alexander explained, his voice filled with urgency. An operation that will make the previous money laundering look like child's play. And they need to be sure nothing can stop them. Walter, who had been monitoring other screens, suddenly tensed. Sir, we have movement at the east entrance of the tunnel. Impossible, Alexander murmured, but the footage didn't lie. More men in black were entering through another passage. They know about the tunnels? We have a traitor, Walter concluded grimly. Sarah felt the fear growing in her chest, but something stronger was beginning to take shape, a determination born from the truth about her father's death. What do we do now? Alexander studied her for a moment as if making a crucial decision. We need to get to the bookstore. If I'm right, your father hid the most important evidence there, probably somewhere only you could find. But how are we going to get out of here? Sarah asked, watching the screens that showed the intruders closing in from both sides. Alexander moved to a seemingly solid wall and pressed a sequence on a hidden panel. A new passage opened, revealing a narrower tunnel. This route leads directly out of the property. It's our only chance. Walter? Sarah turned to the butler, who remained at the control panel. Someone needs to stay behind to delay our visitors, he replied with a calm smile. Go, Miss Henderson. Find what your father protected with his life. Before Sarah could protest, Alexander pulled her toward the passage. The sound of the mechanism closing behind them was like a final seal, separating them from the world she knew. As they ran through the dark tunnel, lit only by Alexander's lantern, Sarah felt her heart beating not just with fear, but with a strange excitement. For the first time in her life, she was about to uncover the truth her father had died to protect. Alexander, she called as they ran, there's something you're not telling me, isn't there? Something about why you chose this moment to bring me to the mansion. He slowed his pace for a moment, his heavy breathing echoing in the narrow tunnel. Your father left specific instructions. The evidence could only be retrieved when you were ready, when you fully understood what was at stake. And you think I'm ready now? Alexander stopped completely, turning to face her in the dim light. We have no choice. The consortium is about to launch their biggest operation in 2 weeks. If we don't stop them now, it will be too late. A distant explosion made the tunnel shake slightly. Sarah thought of Walter, hoping he was okay. What exactly did my father discover that was so important? Not just money laundering schemes, Alexander answered, resuming his walk. He found evidence of something much bigger. The consortium isn't just stealing money, they're manipulating entire markets, influencing politicians, altering the very fabric of society for their own purposes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a metal staircase leading to a hatch in the ceiling. Alexander climbed first, carefully pushing the hatch open. The cool night air poured into the tunnel, and Sarah realized they were in an alley behind her bookstore. How are we going to get in without drawing attention? She asked, observing the main street through the gap between the buildings. Alexander pulled a set of keys from his pocket. Your father gave me a copy of the back door key years ago. He knew this day would come. As they approached the back door of the bookstore, Sarah couldn't help but think about how her life had completely changed in just a few hours. The bookstore, her safe haven for so many years, now seemed to hold secrets she could hardly imagine. Alexander inserted the key into the lock, but before he could turn it, a metallic click sounded behind them. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Mitchell." They turned slowly. A man in an immaculate dark suit pointed a gun at them, his cold smile illuminated by the dim light of the street lamp. "You really thought you could fool us for this long?" "Marcus," Alexander said calmly, his body tense as a spring ready to snap, positioning himself between Sarah and the armed man. "Should have known you'd be involved in this." The yellowish light from the street lamp cast long shadows in the alley, turning Marcus's face into a sinister mask. Sarah felt her stomach twist as she recognized him, not just from her father's funeral, but from old photographs she had found at home, images of a happier time when her father smiled alongside the man now pointing a gun at them. 10 years watching every move you made, Alexander," Marcus replied, his voice smooth like poisoned velvet. 10 long years waiting for you to make a mistake." His cold, calculating eyes shifted to Sarah. "And finally you made one." A sudden memory flooded Sarah's mind. She was 12 in her father's office at Mitchell Enterprises during one of those rare take-your-daughter-to-work days. Marcus had passed by them, tousling her hair with feigned affection while discussing numbers and spreadsheets with her father. Even then, there had been something in his eyes that made her uneasy. "Sarah," Alexander spoke softly, pulling her back to the present, "this is Marcus Reynolds, the current CFO of Mitchell Enterprises." And, he paused, his tone thick with bitterness, "your father's former business partner." The revelation hit Sarah like a cold wave. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The late-night meetings, the whispered phone calls, her father's increasing anxiety in the weeks before his death. "Ah, Thomas," Marcus sighed theatrically, spinning the gun casually between his fingers. "He was a brilliant man truly. Had a gift for numbers that few possessed. It's a shame he didn't know when to stop asking questions." Rage exploded in Sarah's chest, a fury she didn't know she was capable of. You helped kill him?" Her voice echoed down the alley, loaded with a decade of repressed pain. 2 more men emerged from the shadows, their weapons gleaming in the weak light. Sarah recognized their types: professionals, mercenaries, the kind of men Marcus had likely hired to take care of the problem her father had become. "Business is business, my dear," Marcus replied with a nonchalance that made Sarah's blood boil. "Your father was about to destroy something far bigger than he could ever comprehend. The consortium isn't just an organization, it's the future." "The future?" Alexander laughed bitterly, and Sarah noticed how his right hand moved imperceptibly toward his jacket. "You're manipulating lives, destroying families, all for power and money?" Marcus took a step forward, and the mask of civility began to slip, revealing something much darker beneath. "Power and money are just tools, Alexander. The real goal is control. Control over markets, over governments, over the very fate of society." Sarah noticed Alexander's subtle movement and decided to keep Marcus talking. Years of working in the bookstore had taught her that people like him loved the sound of their own voice. "And now? Are you going to kill us like you killed my father?" The question seemed to delight Marcus. "Oh no, not yet," he smiled, and Sarah thought of sharks and predators. "First, you'll tell us where Thomas hid those files. Then." He let the sentence hang in the air, savoring the fear he expected to see in her eyes. But Sarah was no longer scared. The anger had burned away the fear, leaving only cold determination in its place. She thought of her father, of all the nights she had seen him working late, guarding secrets that would eventually get him killed. "Do you really think I came unprepared?" Alexander asked, his voice carrying a note of challenge that served as his only warning. The movement was so quick that Sarah barely registered it. Alexander tossed something to the ground, a small device that immediately filled the alley with a thick, suffocating cloud of smoke. The sound of gunshots exploded into the night, bullets ricocheting off the brick walls as Alexander yanked her toward the bookstore door. They moved in one fluid motion, years of Alexander's military training evident in the way he protected her while simultaneously locking the door behind them. In the dark, the bookstore, her sanctuary for so many years, felt like a maze of shadows and threatening silhouettes. "We have less than a minute before they get in," Alexander whispered, guiding Sarah through the space she knew like the back of her hand, but now it seemed strange and hostile. "We need to find those files." Sarah forced her brain to work, pushing the panic to the back of her mind. But where? Her eyes swept across the familiar darkness of the bookstore. "I know every inch of this place." It was then that the memory hit her, a long-forgotten conversation with Mr. Jenkins, weeks before he sold her the bookstore. He had been particularly sentimental that night, perhaps because of the wine they had shared while taking inventory. "Wait. The pedestal," she said, the excitement of the discovery coloring her voice. "What pedestal?" Alexander asked, following her through the darkness. In the rare books section, Sarah explained quickly, her feet instinctively finding the way. There's an old oak pedestal Mr. Jenkins never allowed anyone to move. He said it was an important historical piece, that it belonged to the bookstore as much as the books themselves. At the time, she had found it strange, his attachment to a simple pedestal, especially considering the literary treasures the store contained. Now it finally made sense. They reached the rare books section where the massive pedestal held an empty display case. Something that always seemed like a waste of valuable space for a display. Sarah ran her hands across the ancient surface, her fingers recognizing each carving and imperfection she had cleaned hundreds of times without ever truly seeing. There must be a mechanism, she murmured, her mind recalling a specific pattern in the carvings that always seemed slightly different from the rest. Something like, ah. A soft click sounded as she pressed the correct sequence, 3 leaf-shaped carvings that, when pressed in the right order, activated a hidden mechanism. The top of the pedestal opened like a mechanical flower, revealing a secret compartment. Inside, protected by decades of secrecy, were a worn leather folder and a flash drive that looked outdated. Incredible, Alexander breathed, reverently picking up the items. Your father thought of everything. He knew you'd find this one day. The sound of glass shattering in front of the bookstore interrupted the moment of discovery. Marcus and his men were entering, and the sound of their boots crunching over the broken glass was like a countdown to disaster. There's no way out, Sarah whispered, the panic finally starting to overcome the adrenaline. There's always a way out, Alexander replied with a confidence she desperately wished she could share. He tucked the items into his jacket and moved to a specific shelf, his fingers dancing across the spines of the books in a sequence that seemed random but which Sarah realized followed a pattern. They were all first editions of classic literature. To her amazement, the entire shelf moved without a sound, revealing a dark passage beyond. How did you? Your father wasn't the only one with secrets, Alexander smiled briefly, the gesture softening the lines of worry on his face for a moment. Mr. Jenkins and I worked together for years. This bookstore has been a safe point in the network for longer than you think. They entered the passage just in time to hear heavy footsteps approaching the rare books section. The shelf slid back into place without making a noise, leaving them in the darkness of the narrow tunnel that smelled of damp earth and buried stories. Where does this lead? Sarah asked as they moved forward, guided by the bluish light of Alexander's phone. To a safe place, he answered, his voice softly echoing off the tunnel walls. But first you need to know the whole truth. About your father, about me, and about why the consortium is really after you. Sarah felt her heart race. What else could there be? How many more secrets had her father buried before his death? Your father wasn't just an accountant, Alexander began, his voice taking on a tone of reverence. He was part of something much bigger, much older than the consortium. An organization dedicated to maintaining the balance between power and justice, to prevent men like Marcus from destroying lives in their quest for control. They reached a metal staircase that stretched upward, disappearing into the darkness. Alexander stopped, turning to face her in the bluish dimness of his phone's light. And you, Sarah, are his rightful heir. The distant sound of voices and footsteps echoed through the tunnel. The consortium had discovered the passage. Sarah glanced up at the staircase that vanished into the darkness above them, then back at Alexander, whose expression was a mix of urgency and concern. Tell me everything, she said, surprised by the firmness of her own voice despite the fear still coursing through her veins. I don't want any more secrets. Alexander nodded gravely, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of approval and apprehension. While we climb. But I must warn you, once you know the truth there's no going back. Your life will never be the same. They began to climb, leaving behind the increasingly close sound of their pursuers. Each step took Sarah closer to a truth that promised not only to reveal the past but to completely reshape her future. As they ascended the endless staircase, Alexander began to reveal a story that would forever change Sarah's understanding of her father and her own destiny. The organization is called the Sentinels, he explained, his voice softly echoing in the vertical passage. It was founded over a century ago by a group of businessmen and financiers who realized how unchecked corporate power could destroy lives. Their goal was to create a system of surveillance and balance within the corporate world itself. Sarah followed closely behind him, each step on the metal staircase reverberating with her footsteps. The sound of their pursuers had diminished, but she knew they were still there, following her trail like persistent shadows. My grandfather was one of the founders, Alexander continued. The Mitchells have always been central to the organization. using our position and resources to protect those who couldn't defend themselves. Your father, he was different. He had a natural gift for seeing patterns where others saw only numbers. A sudden memory flashed in Sarah's mind. Her father sitting at the kitchen table late at night, surrounded by piles of papers, his eyes tired but determined as he worked on something he never shared with her. Thomas discovered something in the company's books that no one else had noticed, Alexander went on, his voice taking on a darker tone. It wasn't just money laundering, it was an elaborate scheme that had been going on for decades. The consortium had infiltrated several major corporations, creating a web of corruption that threatened not only the economy but the very structure of society. They reached a landing, a small metal platform that offered a brief moment of rest. Alexander stopped, turning to face Sarah in the dim light of his phone. Your father knew he was racing against time. He began documenting everything, suspicious transfers, secret meetings, names of those involved. But the most important thing was the algorithm he developed. Algorithm? Sarah asked, her breath still ragged from the climb. A complex program capable of tracking and predicting the movements of the consortium through financial patterns. It was his masterpiece, something that could expose the entire operation. But he knew he was being watched, so he split the information into parts and hid them in different places. The distant sound of metal creaking echoed below them. Their pursuers had found the staircase. Why didn't they search earlier? Sarah questioned as they resumed their climb. Why wait 10 years? Because the program had a security key, Alexander explained. Thomas designed it so that it could only be accessed with a specific sequence of data that only you could provide. Sarah nearly tripped on a step. Me? What do you mean? Your father knew the consortium would come after him. He also knew he had to protect you. So, he created a system that could only be unlocked by someone with your unique knowledge of literature and cataloging systems, combined with personal memories that only his daughter would have. The revelation hit Sarah like a wave. All the stories her father read to her, the word games they invented, the hours they spent together in the library, these weren't just father-daughter moments. They were part of a bigger plan. That's why you've been watching me all these years, she said, understanding finally dawning. It wasn't just to protect me, it was to ensure I developed the necessary skills. Yes and no, Alexander replied, his tone tinged with guilt. The protection was always real. But Thomas had a bigger plan. He knew you would inherit not only his knowledge but also his integrity and moral strength. You were the only person he trusted to continue his work. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the top of the staircase. A heavy metal door blocked their way. Alexander typed a code into an electronic panel, and the door opened with a hydraulic hiss. They entered a room that looked straight out of a spy movie, walls lined with monitors, servers buzzing in the corner, and a central table with state-of-the-art equipment. Welcome to the Sentinel's Operations Center, Alexander said, moving swiftly to one of the computers. This is where we'll find out exactly what your father discovered. Sarah watched as he plugged the flash drive into one of the USB ports. A login screen appeared, requesting a complex password. Now comes the hard part, Alexander said, turning to face her. We need your memories, Sarah. The program will only accept answers that only you know. The sound of footsteps on the stairs was closer now. Sarah could hear muffled voices and the metallic clink of weapons. How much time do we have? She asked, sitting down at the computer. Minutes at most, Alexander replied, drawing a gun from the hidden holster. The other sentinels are on their way, but we need to buy time. The first question appeared on the screen. What was the last book Thomas Henderson read to his daughter? Tears began to form in Sarah's eyes. It was a memory she held dear, a memory she cherished like treasure. Her father sitting at the edge of her bed, reading The Secret Garden on the night before his death. Her hands trembled over the keyboard as she typed the answer. More questions followed, details of her childhood, patterns in the books they shared, codes they had made together in their games. The sound on the stairs was growing louder. Alexander positioned himself by the door, gun in hand. Last question, Sarah announced, her voice tense. On the screen, where is the secret garden? She closed her eyes, letting the memories flow. It wasn't about the book, she realized. It was about the special place she and her father had shared, a small garden on the rooftop of their old house, where he used to tell stories on summer nights. With trembling fingers, she typed in the exact coordinates. The screen flickered, and then a flood of data began appearing, documents, spreadsheets, emails, all revealing the true extent of the consortium's conspiracy. I did it, she exclaimed, but her victory was interrupted by the sound of gunshots on the stairs. Sarah, Alexander called urgently, there's one more thing you need to know about your father. About us? Before he could finish, the stairwell door exploded inward. Marcus emerged through the smoke, his once elegant suit now torn and stained, his eyes blazing with murderous fury. "End of the line," he snarled, aiming his gun directly at Sarah. The sound of more gunshots echoed through the room, but this time they came from another direction. The opposite wall suddenly opened, revealing a team of armed men and women. The sentinels had finally arrived. In the chaos that followed, Sarah realized her life would never be the same. Her father's legacy, the secrets of the sentinels, the truth about Alexander, all of it mixed together in a storm of revelations that threatened to consume her. But amidst the conflict, one thing was clear: she finally understood why her father had chosen this path. And now, it was her turn to choose what role she would play in this silent war unfolding in the shadows of power. The chaos inside the Sentinels' operations room was deafening. Gunshots rang out from every direction, ricocheting off the metal walls as members of the consortium and the Sentinels engaged in a deadly firefight. Sarah ducked behind a computer desk, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst from her chest. Alexander moved with the precision of someone trained for situations like this, taking down two of Marcus's men while protecting Sarah. "We need to get to the main server," he shouted over the noise. "That's where the backup of the entire system is." Amid the confusion, Sarah saw Marcus retreating into a side corridor, a sinister smile on his face as he typed something into a portable device. "He's trying to erase everything," she realized in horror. "Sarah," Alexander called, his voice carrying an urgency she had never heard before. "There's something you need to know. About your father, about me?" A nearby explosion interrupted them, forcing them to separate. Sarah scrambled to another console, her hands shaking as she accessed the system. Years spent working with digital cataloging suddenly made sense. Her father had prepared her exactly for this moment. "The backup's being deleted," she shouted, watching as warning messages flashed on the screens. Her fingers flew over the keyboard trying to stop the process. That's when a new window popped up, a video. Her father's face filled the monitor, younger than in her last memories of him, but with the same gentle eyes she missed so much. "Sarah, my dear," Thomas Henderson's recorded voice filled her ears, even amid the chaos. "If you're seeing this, it means you've uncovered the truth. There's something you need to know." The image flickered, and Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as her father continued. "Alexander isn't just my friend and protector. He's your uncle, my younger brother." The world seemed to freeze around Sarah. She looked at Alexander, who had just taken down another consortium agent, and for the first time she saw the resemblance. The same determined eyes as her father, the same jawline. "We kept this secret to protect both of you," the recording continued. "The consortium had already threatened our family. Alexander took a different name, built a new identity, everything to stay close and watch over you without raising suspicion." A scream of rage sliced through the air. Marcus had returned, his imposing figure blocking the exit. "What a touching scene," he sneered, gun aimed. "The family finally reunited. Too bad it will be for such a short time." "It's over, Marcus," Alexander said, positioning himself between Sarah and the weapon. "Thomas's program has already sent all the evidence to authorities in 5 different countries. You've lost." Marcus's face twisted into a mask of rage. "If I go down, I'll take you all with me." He pressed a button on his device, and alarms began blaring throughout the complex. "Self-destruct sequence initiated," a computerized voice announced. 5 minutes until detonation." "Sarah, finish the upload," Alexander shouted, engaging Marcus in hand-to-hand combat. The weapon flew from the executive's hand, and the two men collided in a brutal fight. With trembling but determined fingers, Sarah worked at the console, making sure every byte of information was transmitted. The evidence her father had died to protect, the years of secrets and surveillance, everything had to be preserved. 3 minutes until detonation. Alexander and Marcus continued their deadly struggle, blood dripping from cuts on their faces. Sarah could see the resemblance to her father more clearly now in every move her uncle made, the same unyielding determination, the same unwavering sense of justice. "Upload complete," the computer announced, and Sarah felt a weight lift off her shoulders. But there was no time to relax. 2 minutes until detonation. Marcus managed to break free from Alexander and ran toward an emergency ladder. "You'll never make it out of here alive," he shouted before disappearing. "Let him go," Alexander said, running to Sarah. "We need to get out now." They ran through the maze-like hallways, the sound of the countdown echoing in their ears. Sarah held tightly to the USB drive containing her father's last words, his final legacy. 1 minute to detonation. They finally reached a service elevator. Alexander punched in a code and the doors opened. They stepped in just as the voice announced the final 30 seconds. The elevator ascended rapidly, but Sarah could feel every second dragging on like an eternity. She looked at Alexander, her uncle, her protector, the last link to her father, and saw in him all the answers she had always sought. 10 seconds, 9, 8. Sarah, Alexander said softly, holding her hand, your father would be proud. 3, 1. The world exploded. The elevator shook violently but kept rising. When it finally stopped and the doors opened, they emerged onto a helipad atop a commercial building. The sun was rising on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Below them, sirens blared as police cars converged on the site. In the distance, a helicopter was pulling away, Marcus probably fleeing once again. And now? Sarah asked, still holding Alexander's hand. He smiled, the same kind smile she remembered from her father. Now we continue the work. The Sentinels need a new generation of guardians, and you, my niece, have proven more than capable. Sarah looked out at the awakening city, thinking of her bookstore, her old life, all the secrets that had been revealed. Nothing would be the same, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Father, she whispered into the morning wind, I hope you're proud. And somewhere in the shadows between the skyscrapers, she could have sworn she felt his presence, smiling. 6 months had passed since that morning on the helipad. Paginas and Memorias remained a cozy bookstore for everyone who walked through its doors, but now it hid a greater purpose behind its calm facade. The basement had been transformed into a modern operations center, where Sarah and other Sentinels monitored suspicious activities in the corporate world. Sarah was cataloging a new shipment of books when the doorbell chimed. Alexander, or Uncle Alex as she now called him privately, walked in carrying a newspaper and a coffee for each of them. The latest news is promising, he said, handing her one of the cups. 3 executives from the consortium were arrested this morning in an international operation. The evidence your father gathered keeps knocking down dominoes. Sarah smiled, thinking about how much her life had changed. The pain of losing her father would never fully disappear, but it had been transformed into something meaningful, a purpose that honored his memory. Any sign of Marcus? She asked, although she already knew the answer. Alexander shook his head. Still on the run. But his network is crumbling. It's only a matter of time before we find him. Sarah nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. The familiar aroma reminded her of mornings with her father, when he'd bring coffee and donuts before heading to work. Now she understood that every one of those moments had been precious, not only for the love but also for the legacy he was building. I found something else in Dad's files, she said, moving over to the counter where a discreet laptop displayed lines of code. It looks like he had identified cells of the consortium in at least 12 other companies. I'm cross-referencing the data with current financial patterns. Alexander watched her work with evident pride. You have the same gift he had for seeing beyond the numbers. But remember what we talked about, don't let this consume your life like it consumed his. Sarah smiled, recognizing the concern in his voice. I won't. That's why I have you to remind me to take coffee breaks. The sound of footsteps on the stairs leading to the basement interrupted their conversation. Emily Chin, one of the new recruits of the Sentinels, emerged with an excited expression. You need to see this, she said, handing Sarah a tablet. We've just intercepted a series of suspicious transfers. The pattern matches exactly what your father described in the algorithm. Sarah studied the data, feeling that familiar thrill of discovery. Her father had created not only a program to track criminal activities but a legacy of justice that continued to grow. I think we've found our next mission, she said, looking at Alexander. He nodded, a smile appearing on his face. Then we better get ready. The Sentinels have work to do. As they descended into the operations center in the basement, Sarah thought about how her life had transformed. The bookstore, which had once been just her refuge, was now a base of operations for something much larger. The books she loved were still there, but now they shared space with cutting-edge technology and important secrets. At the end of the day, after the last customer had left and the doors were locked, Sarah climbed up to her apartment above the bookstore. On the wall in her office, a picture of her father smiled at her. Not the formal photo from his office at Mitchell Enterprises, but a casual one taken during a picnic when she was a child. Next to the picture, framed, was an excerpt from the last email he had written, discovered in the recovered files. My dear Sarah, everything I did, every decision I made, was with the thought of creating a better world for you. Not a perfect world, that would be impossible, but one where justice still has a chance against greed. Trust Alexander. Trust your heart. And remember, sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen not in battlefields, but in quiet offices and dusty books. With eternal love, Dad. Sarah gently touched the glass of the frame. The world was still not perfect, but she was doing her part to make it better, one file, one secret, one mission at a time. It was a job that would never truly end, but that no longer scared her. Through the window, the city lights sparkled like earthly stars. Somewhere out there, Marcus and others like him continued their operations in the shadows. But now, there was a new generation of sentinels watching, protecting, fighting the silent battle for justice. Sarah Henderson, daughter, niece, librarian, and sentinel, smiled at the night. Tomorrow would be another day of books, secrets, and missions, and she was ready for all of them. And you, what do you think Sarah will find on her next mission? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this thrilling story and want more intense adventures like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. It helps our channel grow and allows us to bring more amazing stories to you. See you next time.